Welcome back to another episode of The Hit. My name is James Layton, CEO and founder of Anderson James. This is the podcast where every single week I bring you a leader from our sector to discuss some of the biggest challenges in UK housing today. Today on The Hip, I was delighted to be joined by Richard Hill, Chief Executive of bpha. We talk at length around his leadership positions that has led him to be the Chief Executive of bpha. We talk about and as he reflects on his time as Vice Chair of the G15. We also talk about some of the things that he's going to implement at bpha and how he's going to focus some of his time on regeneration across Bedford. We also talk about some of the tips and insights that he would give to aspiring young leaders in housing today. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you do, I'd ask that you like and subscribe. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, glad to be here. Thanks, James.
Excited for this one. As we always like to start, do you mind just giving us an introduction to yourself, please?
Okay, so I'm Richard Hill. I'm Chief Executive of bpha, based in Bedford. I've been a Chief Executive of a couple of other housing associations, One and Spectrum. And before that, I was Deputy Chief Executive for a while at the Homes and Communities Agency before it became Homes England. All of those organisations except bpha have changed their names since, right? So
yeah, absolutely. And I suppose, I always like to ask this, but how did you get into the sector? What was the journey into our sector, would you say?
So I started off first 10, 15 years of my career in completely different. I was in health, I was in education for a bit. I did quite a lot of work on, financial appraisals and investment. And then I got a job at the Housing Corporation in 2005, 2006 as their Director of Investment. And my pitch was, I know about investment, but I don't know about housing. And they were foolish enough at the time to allow me in. And I've been really excited about working in housing since then. But it's not been my only career. It's my kind of second one in a kind of slightly odd way.
Yeah, I always like to ask it because most people fell into it in some way, shape or form and never chose it, which I'm hoping we're going to change the perception.
I was trying to avoid the words fell into it, but basically I fell into it. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, man. And sort of, you've been in the sector a long time and you've held a lot of senior leadership roles, like you said. What have been some of the fundamental changes you've seen in the sector in that time, and what have been some of the things that have evolved in that period?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think the big change over the time I've been in the sector is in the mid-2000s, I think everybody was really focused on development. The Labour government was putting a lot of money into investment in housing. Decent Homes was nearly done, and development was top of everybody's agenda. Every meeting you went to was about development. Yeah. And probably at that time, we talked a little too little about customer and maybe not enough about quality of existing kind of stock. And I think we've had a long swing, particularly kind of prompted by Grenfell and some awful things we've changed, I think, as a sector to focus more on customer now than we've ever done. And maybe that's had a consequence that we do focus a bit less on development and new build. And it's always a balance between the various things. But I think that's been the big change. And then I think, obviously, if you've been working in something as long as I have, markets change and regulation change and all of that. And I think one thing that's been great is the sector adapts, and organisations like Housing Association adapts to that as we go along. And at the moment, the market's not great, and there's maybe more regulation than we've had for a while. But maybe in 5 years' time, the market is perfect, and regulations are different. So you adjust to stuff as you go along. But I think that first one is the biggest change over that sort of 20 years or so.
Yeah, and it's cyclical, right? As well, the challenge is cyclical as well. Like you seem to see different things at different periods, and I've seen quite a few different cycles over my career. I've only done housing 12, 13 years, but I've seen quite a lot of cycles in that time. So I imagine that'll continue. Yeah,
it's funny, really, because I think in some ways housing property is the most long-term business, right? You're creating things that last 70, 80, 100 years. So it should be a really, really long-term business, and your long-term plan, you have a 30-year business plan and all of that sort of stuff. But you're right, there's also that immediate, markets change, priorities change. So I think part of the job has always been, part of the chief executive job, part of board's job has always been marrying that long-term vision with what you have to do in the short term. And it does fluctuate maybe more than you'd think, really. When you work in it, it seems more fluid than kind of if you sit outside, I guess.
Yeah, I bet. And you've done some big senior leadership roles, this being one of them. But what do you reflect on the previous roles, Spectrum, One, and some of the fundamental learns in those roles that you're going to bring into BPHA, would you say?
So I think so I was saying this morning. Actually, I did part of our induction to some of our new staff who were starting, and so they asked me a similar question. And one of the answers is that one was London based, lots of flats, lots of high rise buildings. Spectrum was on the south coast, kind of quite rural markets. So one of my big learns really is that you might work for a housing association, but they're place-based organisations, right? And where they are matters a lot, and what your strategy is needs to be based on what you're doing in Bedford or Cambridge, not what you did in your previous role. So partly, I think it's a kind of learning that you start a little bit from scratch. Partly, I think one thing I have come to, I think maybe this is one of the reasons why I've liked the sector actually, but I do think the values thing, people say this a lot, but I do think it's really important.
I agree.
And having, being clear about your organisational values and how they align to your own is a big deal, even if kind of what you do changes. And certainly in the first 3 months, I'm finding that kind of, you want to spend a lot of time listening and not as much time talking, because there's 500 people here, all of whom know more about BPHA than I do. And part of the great bit of starting as a chief exec for a new organisation is picking their brains, working out what kind of what they think about the organisation. Yeah. But that's one thing I've liked about my career is I've moved around a little bit, and that's helped me to kind of understand different contexts.
Yeah, and how does that change from business to business? Do you, as a leader, do you go in and have a predefined idea of how you're going to shape the culture and the behaviours, or do you wait and listen and then make your plan based on that, would you say? I
think it's funny, isn't it? Because, you do recruitment, right? So I think part of the recruitment process is them learning about you, but part of it is you learning about them.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you do a lot of kind of working your way into that. And then I think what you do when you start is pretty situational. It really does depend where the organisation is. So, for example, here there's a strong set of values that people talk about all the time. People understand what the mission is. There's a little bit to do, but not it's certainly not starting from scratch. When I started at One, I felt, and I think the board there felt, that the organisation had lost its way a little bit in terms of what its value set was, what it was aiming to do. And the first 6 months there was a little bit more, we need to have, a new strategy, and, we need to talk to our residents and our staff about values. So it really does depend, I think. You kind of do. I do think there's a kind of, I say this a few times at various things here. I think there is a kind of, you're not using the same hammer to crack the same nut in every place you go, really. Things that people are very different, places are very different.
Yeah, and I think that can sometimes be the misconception with housing associations. People think they're all the same. They're not, actually. They've got real regional differences, but definitely have got differences from cultures and value proposition, haven't they?
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely right. And I think part of what you're trying to do when you start somewhere new is talk to your colleagues and staff and residents, but also your partners, like the local authorities. And they know that they are very different to the local authorities you've dealt with in previous places. So if you go with the same things, it doesn't work, right? It has to be a deeper understanding of, where you're operating and what the needs are.
Yeah, absolutely. But I agree with you, actually. I think when people move around a little, they do get some different experiences, and that shapes their leadership style a little bit differently as well. So they can pull things from different organisations that have worked well, and that can help you with solution mindset, can't it, I think?
Yeah. So I've been rubbish in terms of, some of my chief executive colleagues are good enough to stay at the same place for 20, 25 years. I've never managed that. And my rationale, my upside to that is you learn differently as you work in different places. But yeah, so there's apples and there's ups and downs to that, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I know, obviously, recently finished your tenure as vice chair of the G15. What did that help and equip you with? Because I suppose that gives you a flavour of loads of different businesses and loads of different experiences. But what are some of the things that you're proud of in that tenure, and also, what are some of the exciting things that they were doing that you're really, really looking forward to seeing them manifest?
So the G15 is a really interesting organisation and grouping. And I'm tempted to say it's like Fight Club, right? The first rule of G15 is you can't talk about people. Yeah. But I think that's become a really interesting forum, because you've got some really big organisations there with a national focus, like Clarion, Riverside now. You've got some organisations that are really substantial with a London focus, so Peabody. and you've got some organisations that are smaller. So one was, I used to say was at the championship end rather than the Premiership end of the G15 in terms of size, at least. So you get a good mix of organisation, and I think that means you get a good conversation about strategy and approach.
Absolutely.
And there's never been an attempt to have everybody do the same thing, because they're too different. Yeah. But you get a really strong organisation in terms of, really strong collective in terms of lobbying and talking to the mayor and government, and that really works. And I think in terms of thinking about my time at the G15, and Geeta was chair and I was vice chair, and Geeta should take all the credit for the work the G15 did. But I think the two things that he did over the last couple of years that I think were really good were he did a lot more work on equality, diversity and inclusion. That had never been a priority for the G15 if you go back 5-10 years. So at one, we ran the G15 Accelerate programme for middle managers. And I think that EDI focus is really important for the sector. It's really important for BPHA, but it's really important to do that in a concrete way, not just talk about it, but actually do things.
I agree.
So I think that was a really positive thing. And I think the other thing, which is a more kind of behind the scene things, I think the G15 was pretty influential last year in terms of the rent settlement. And the National Housing Federation should take a lot of the credit for the way it managed it. But I think the G15 was quite influential in demonstrating that if government had chosen to go for 0% or 3%, that would have been really difficult for the sector.
Okay.
And actually, that would have probably been more difficult for organisations not in the G15, some of the smaller organisations than the G15 itself. But I think that lobbying is important. So the way the G15 worked with the Fed at that point, I think was really good. Yeah. So I'm a big fan of the G15. And one thing I've enjoyed at BPHA is we're members of Build East. So we have a similar forum in the East of England. So looking forward to being part of that.
Yeah, and talk to me about BPHA. So congratulations on the role, firstly, I suppose.
Thank you.
Still relatively new in post, I suppose.
Not past my probation yet, James.
Yeah, I was going to say, you delayed this podcast recording until that, so that was good. But just give us a helicopter overview of the business as you see it today, and then we can sort of dig into kind of what the plans are and where they've been.
So Kevin, who I took over from, built a really solid organisation. So G1, V1, A+ with S&P. So financially very solid and resilient. And one of the things we say to our partners a lot is, we're here for the long term, and that's because, we built that strong base. Really strong local expertise in terms of understanding, the places and the communities where we work. Some things we've been really good at, I think. So I think it's 87% EPCC and above. So, we really have invested in our, homes in terms of environmental performance, and that's great. We've got some community hubs, so we're ahead of the curve on some of the stuff that's in the, working with your customers, which is good. And, lots of opportunities for us in terms of, I think we're in a part of the country where if the country is going to grow, and if the country is going to kind of, be economically successful and successful more generally, then that sort of Oxford, Cambridge, Bedford part of the world, will need to be successful, and it will need good quality homes. So, a good place, but a good organisation. And I should say, in case anybody's listening, lots of nice people.
Really, we'll snippet that out. But that's good. And I know when you come in, we talked about this a little bit just a minute ago, but you come in as chief exec and you've got all these ideas and stuff. But what was the role described to you, and kind of what is your key vision that you've got for BPHA in the near term, really, or the medium term?
Well, I think it was described to me and sold to me very positively in terms of where we are. And we do really well on the great place to work stuff. So it is a really nice place to work. And then I think the challenges for us are, we're in a difficult part of the world in terms of retaining and recruiting great people, because people can commute to London in 40 minutes. So we need to work really hard to be a really good employer to make sure we've got the people that we need to kind of give our customers good service. And that really is true. It's a really tough recruitment market. And then we need to think about how we grow, because as well as being a great landlord, we need to be on the front foot in terms of new homes. There's a lot of housing need in this area. Yeah. And I think probably that's the area where we need to do most work in terms of thinking about how we do that and how we balance what historically we've done in terms of being a good partner for developers on Section 106 to do more kind of, partnership development, more work with our local authorities. So what I'm trying to describe, I think, is the organisation's got a solid base, but there's definitely areas where we need to do work. And I think partly we need to be a bit more outward facing in the sense that we've got some good local partnerships, but we could do with growing some of our partnerships across the area. So part of my job as a chief executive is to get out there and describe what bpha does and encourage people to work with us. And that's part of the work that I need to do in the next few months.
Yeah, and only because it was recent, you've obviously gone through recruitment yourself for bpha. What were some of the things that really stood out for you for the great places to work stuff? Like, I know that these are all scored properly, but what were some of the key things that you thought, really got that right? I
think they're good on the values, and making them live within the business, and I think that's really important. And it does come through actually when you talk to people. I think they've done a good job at. I think COVID's changed the world, right? I think people underestimate what it's done. I mean, it really has changed the world. And one thing that I've really liked in terms of being here and being outside London a bit actually is the office environment is vibrant and lively at the same time as we've got a reasonably flexible approach for when people are in or not. And certainly I was finding in London a little bit that actually getting back to that office vibrancy was quite hard because people had got used to not using difficult commutes, public transport, and all of that. So I think that's a really positive thing for the organisation. And then I think one of the big things here, because I think we're the right sort of size for this, is all organisations have silos. It's impossible not to have structures. But what I notice when I go around is there's really good interaction between teams. People chat in the kitchen. People talk about things that aren't work sometimes. That's great. And at the end of meetings and the start of meetings, people have a conversation that's about, how they are as people. And all of that is a really nice kind of culture, I think.
Yeah. You mentioned something about COVID there. I totally agree. And I think one thing that the housing sector has got really right for me, 90% of the time, is this flexible working piece of having a base and some vibrancy within an office environment, but having some flex. I think we've absolutely nailed that piece now, in my opinion. And I think other sectors are going down the route of everyone back in the office 5 days a week, 7 till 7, and all this sort of culture starting to appear again. It's not going to work. I think we've got the right balance now. I think we've got to the right hybrid balance that we needed.
I completely agree with that. I mentioned earlier on that, we're in a difficult recruitment market. So I think partly, we need to be flexible to attract people to come and work for us because we're not going to pay, Goldman Sachs salaries. So, and I think that flexibility and trusting people to do the right thing with that flexibility is an important part of, the way it works. And I think balancing that with when people come in the office, it's not to sit at a desk and stare at a computer. There are things that happen and it is a vibrant, lively environment, just works really well. And I've been meeting quite a lot of my fellow housing association chief executives. So I've been to other people's office recently, and I get the same vibe there as well. So it is.
I agree, and I worry for London, and I love London. I lived there for a long time myself. I also lived in Hertfordshire. I think you'll actually find that your recruitment market gets better because I think the 40, 50-minute train into London will start to become too much for some people and they'll want to move back out to where they live. But London's a big commuting city, and actually people don't want to spend 50 minutes on a train anymore. They just don't.
I think what COVID did show us is that work-life balance stuff is really important, isn't it? And, leaving for work at 6 and getting home at 9 is not is not 5 days a week, is not is not the right balance. So I think what we're offering people, and lots of colleagues in the sector are doing this, is that a better balance with rewarding work, with the opportunity to be in the office, and at some points where that feels like a nice thing to do and a positive thing to do.
Yeah, and the working environment, not to go into this and segue into this for too long, but the working environment's really important, isn't it? If it's not vibrant and it's not the right place to work, it's not attractive enough now to get people to want to come into the office, and so that's an important part as well.
Yeah. I do think that's right. I mean, I always think the recruitment is partly about getting people to like you and come and work for you. It's not entirely one-way street, is it? And I think offices are the same thing, right? It's not, you need to provide the sort of environment that people want to be in. It's not just functional. It's a it's something more than that.
But I remember when I started my career in housing, people didn't invest in office space or the design or the collaboration spaces that they needed because it was frowned upon. And now it's not, because clearly they need the right people to work for them to deliver the right services for customers. It's all interlinked, isn't it now?
Yeah, dead on. Absolutely. Completely agree.
Talk to me about the communities, because when I was looking at bpha, you mapped across quite a lot of communities, aren't you, in terms of locations wise? So just help me understand the different communities and areas that you cover.
So we were originally the stock transfer in Bedford.
Yeah.
That's 33 years ago.
Yeah.
So Bedford is an interesting place. We about half of our homes are there at the moment, about 10,000 of our homes. And it's a really interesting town, and it is a town rather than a city. Very diverse, big Italian community, but diverse communities across the range. Somebody told me the other day, the local MP told me the other day, it was as diverse, the most diverse place outside London, and that might be true. It sounded kind of plausible to me. So it's quite a diverse community. We have lots of different communities in Bedford, and then we go out to Cambridge in the east and Oxford in the west. Right. And what we've got kind of is a few places where values are very different, homes are very different, and priorities are very different. So we've got about 4,000 homes in Cambridgeshire, and what our residents want in Cambridge and Cambridgeshire is very different to what we can offer in Bedford and what people want in Bedford. So part of what we're trying to do, I think, is to make sure that our offer relates to what our residents and customers in those areas want, which is part of the listening piece. Yeah. I kind of think that, housing associations are all different and have different views of what they do. My view has always been housing association, primarily about housing, but you also are, a key community anchor organisation. I think we're the second or third biggest employer in Bedford. So we should be working with the local authority and our other partners.
Yep.
Not just to make kind of, our homes great, but to make sure that Bedford feels like a nice place to live in. So, that community role, I think, is really important to us.
Yeah, and given the nuances within culture, as you said, and values, etc., how do you keep the consistent communication and collaboration with residents in those different areas? How have you balanced that and how made sure that you are collaborating and you are communicating the right messages?
So we're doing a lot of work at the moment, and this started before I got here, about thinking about that customer engagement stuff. Yeah. And it is partly, we know that customer regulations changing, we know tenant satisfaction. So it's partly driven by that, but I think it's more that the organisation wants to work, really closely with that customer base. And I think the view that we've got is there's not one thing, right, that works. Different things work in different places. So I think the community hub idea that was in the Better Social Housing Task Force works in some places. We've got about 5 or 6 community hubs in Bedford, Cambridge. We've got a presence there regularly in that community. We own a lot of the homes. We work with the local schools. That really is a kind of embedded process of bpha staff are there a lot. And, lots of that interaction is great and face-to-face and really positive. Yeah. And then, we've got some, dispersed communities as well, because we work in some rural areas, and there we're never going to have that community hub work in the same way. We don't have enough homes. We don't have the resources to do that.
Got you.
But then we need to give people the chance to kind of, tell us really quickly what they thought of their last repair, what they think of, this service or that service, and then try and respond to that. And the trouble with the tenant satisfaction measures is they look back from a long period of time. So they're important for the regulator and for us, but they're not the things that tell you how to run the business now. So we need to make sure we're doing stuff that help us run the organisation now, really. Yeah. So we're putting a lot of time and effort into it, but I think we're all kind of learning how to do it well.
Yeah. Okay. And the community hubs, talk me through them a little bit, just in terms of what's the look and feel, what's the purpose, what are you trying to get out of that? Is it just to bring a better connection between resident, customer, and bpha, or is it more designed as a community hub for residents of those local communities?
So they're definitely the second, I think, okay. Primarily, because I think you need to be doing it for your residents and customers rather than for you. Yeah. So, the things that you do within the community hubs. So we've got one in Cambridge where we do cooking classes, we do coffee mornings, we do all of that stuff. And what we're providing, I think, is is some training, some employment opportunities, some volunteering opportunities, but also just the space for people to meet their neighbours and do all that sort of stuff. And it's next to a local school, and that works brilliantly in terms of traffic. So our customers get a lot out of that, and the thing that we get out of that is we have people there on a regular basis in conversation. People tell you what they like about their homes, what they don't like, what they think about, all of that soft stuff, that soft intelligence that's really important in terms of the way the organisation works. But I think that works much better than having a sort of desk that says BPHA, come and talk to me about BPHA, because people have got lots of things going on in their lives. You need to provide stuff that's interesting and entertaining and useful for them. And when you do that, people will talk to you about the stuff that you're interested in.
Well, it's not forced either, right? It's natural, so it feels natural. If it's forced, you get the wrong answer. So you want it, you want it in a natural environment.
That's absolutely right.
And I know you started life in Bedford specifically, obviously with the transfer, but you do a lot in the town centre in Bedford, don't you? And I know, having tracked your career over a period of time, you're massive into this anyway. But how much of a part does Regen play in that, and how much of an investing in that local community and infrastructure piece play in that for you, for BPHA?
So that's really important for us, I think. I mean, I do think we think of ourselves as the local authority's key partner in terms of the town centre. So we've got one thing that we're doing and one thing that we'd like to do, and we had Kate Henderson here earlier in the week, and we showed her both, actually. So we've just refurbished one of our big tower blocks outside the station in Bedford, reclad, but done lots of things on, to improve the quality of that building for residents, like landscaping and all of that. And part of the reason we've done that is, the most important reason is for our residents and the quality of their accommodation.
Of course.
We've improved the EPC ratings and all of that. But also, it's the first thing you see when you go out of Bedford Station, and having that as looking great is a really positive for the town. So the local authority have been very positive about the work we've done. And then we've got a big potential region opportunity in the centre of Bedford, in one of our areas where we've got 3 tower blocks. And we'd like to do, a really significant regeneration that, really looks at improving that part of the town for housing primarily, particularly affordable housing, but also with some other opportunities. And I think that would be a big investment for us, and it will involve a lot of partnership working with the local authority and other organisations. But I think that's part of our job, because we're not doing our job for our residents in Bedford unless we're thinking about the town centre and the economic future of Bedford. And I think that's why housing associations are really important, really, because we can think about that as a 10 to 15 year project, and we can mobilise resources to do that. And if we can get that right, that could be amazing. So that's one of our priority things to think about and work on over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and it's nice to see, I'm sure you're aware of this, but you will be, but it's nice to see that Homes England have opened up the funding now for regeneration in the sector, as opposed to just being centred around new homes. I mean, I'm conflicted on that statement, because I think we need both. But I do think it's nice to see the regeneration piece being funded better.
Yeah. We definitely need both, bang on. But I do think that tilt towards regen is really welcome. I'm going to say to them in a few months' time that I've got an ideal opportunity in Bedford for them to invest in. But I was going to say plug. but I think it's also right, actually. I think one of the things that we were doing at Watton was looking at some of our estates on the Isle of Dogs, where we, those estates, if one did nothing to them for the next 10, 15 years, would be in a very poor state. And it's not good enough to those residents to say, we're not prioritising this, we're only prioritising new build. Homes England, that would be an odd position, because I think you end up with the problems that you have poor quality accommodation, all those sorts of things. So I do think regen is an important thing for housing associations, for Homes England, and in big cities and towns, across the country, really important for the country as well, actually.
Yeah, I agree. And you've mentioned some of this already, but if you just to surmise them, what would you say some of the key priorities are for BPHA as an organisation in 2023? So the short-term stuff, what are some of the really key tangible things that you want to tackle as an organisation?
This year?
Yeah, well, this year, next year, like short-term kind of, priorities.
Yeah, so I think we're really working hard on some of the customer stuff that we've already talked about. I think we're doing okay. We're doing some good stuff, but we need to kind of, we need to be conscious that tenant satisfaction measures and regulation is going to change the world. So we need to be absolutely on top of that. So we're prioritising our work with customers. So that's first thing. Second thing is we're going to look at our development strategy. So we're kind of, doing kind of, stuff on new build in a sensible way in a difficult market, but not still having that commitment and still looking to build that pipeline because we still think new homes are important.
Absolutely.
And thirdly, and this is a long-term priority because it's going to take 10, 15 years to, get to where we want to be. But thinking about those regen opportunities and developing the partnerships that we need to make them happen. So those are kind of, we've got lots of priorities, but as all organisations have too many, right? But those are our three things that we'd really like to crack on with this year, I think.
Yeah. And as we take a look at the future, I suppose, and this is probably a double question in terms of BPHA, but the broader sector, what do you see as some of the key challenges we're going to face in the next 5 years? Because, we know the obvious ones, and I talk about them every week, is, cost of living crisis is awful, development challenges. But what do you see as the key things in the 5 years that are going to be some real key challenges we've got to overcome as a sector?
So you told me not to be too gloomy on this.
No, but we'll make it nice and positive. Don't worry. But, it's good to tackle them because otherwise I'm just putting a podcast out there to just shine all the good stuff.
So I think we're in a bit of a fog at the moment. I think the problem is there's no sort of long-term housing strategy, and that's not always been true. I think in previous times when I worked in the sector, you've known kind of broadly speaking where governments and local authorities want to be over the next 5 years. And that's just not true at the moment.
No.
So what that does, I think, is it makes decision-making when you get to the housing association more difficult because you're making kind of best guesses really about where things might go. So, there was all sorts of value in having long-term rent settlements for 5 years that people knew, you knew what was going to happen, you could plan for it. So I think government needs to, it doesn't need to put loads of money into housing. That would be great, but it doesn't need to. But it does need to give some long-term certainty on stuff that matters. So I think the two examples are, just be clear about what's going to happen to rents over a reasonably long-term period.
Yeah.
And if you want us to get to carbon net zero in 2050, great. Lay out the path to get there. And I think all the evidence from previous kind of periods is if you do things like that, then the sector can respond and do great things. So I'm a little bit pessimistic about the external environment because I think it's difficult, but I'm pretty optimistic about BPHA actually because I think we're doing the right things, and I think with a bit of certainty, we've got a good operating geography. We've got a good base. We can do some amazing stuff. But the more you make that environment uncertain, the less organisations like us will be able to do, and that's not to anybody's benefit really.
No, I agree, and I think I've talked about this loads actually, but I think we've just got to stop it becoming a political football that people kick about because the reality is making long-term strategic decisions based on 1 to 2 year whim decisions makes it really difficult, doesn't it? Because, I worry about, when the Green Deal came out in 2010 to 2003, I can't remember what it was exactly, and all of a sudden it died of death and no one ever spoke about it again. And feels like we're back in that sometimes where I hope we don't pull the plug on this because...
Yeah. Well, that's a brilliant example because the way housing and property works, right? It's, as you were saying before, it's a long-term thing.
It is.
So if you create a long-term framework, then supply chains change, and then costs come down, and you get all sorts of positive benefits from kind of saying we're going to do decent homes or whatever. The more you chop and change policies in the short term, you don't get the supply chain, you don't get any of the kind of economies. You end up kind of with stuff that then doesn't work. And I think we kind of need, as a sector, we need to land that message, and not in a way that it kind of seems like we're asking for the world, and maybe not asking for numbers or whatever, but just being clear about, we're organisations, we're big grown-up organisations. We turn over lots. Most of us have, decent operating service. We can do lots of stuff, but you need an operating environment that gives you a reasonable amount of certainty. Not everything, because the world changes, but on the things that matter.
It does, but it's the previous chopping and changing that's caused this uncertainty. Because I look at it from a talent trend perspective, and I think there's a lot of contractors and partners and supply chain out there that are deciding not to upskill staff in certain areas because they're just not sure if it'll change. And so it's all good and well talking about decarbonisation teams and retrofit and all this. Well, we need to train a whole workforce of how to do some of those things. It's a lot of investment up front on a fairly flimsy strategy document, I think. So
that's right. And it makes everything more difficult. Workforce planning, it makes it more difficult. Raising money, it makes it more difficult. All that stuff.
And what do you think will happen? Because I know you've done a lot of development in your career, so I'm asking more out of interest than I am about bpha. But what do you think will happen for development? My current view on it is we've seen jobs pulled all over the sector in the last 12 months. Definitely ambition for development's dwindled slightly, and it becomes more about what we can afford now rather than what we need. Always a dangerous place for me to think we're going to be as a sector. But what do we think? Is the market going to just soften and then it'll get better in 6 months and we'll start to see some more development? Or do you think we're in this kind of confused state for a while now?
Well, in a way, the market's been, a little bit more resilient than I thought it would be 6 months ago. Actually, the response to the interest rate increase has not been as much as I thought. I mean, I think there's two things happening at the same time on there. One of which is, we're having to prioritise our capacity on, some of our existing homes and getting to zero carbon. That's absolutely right. So development comes third rather than first, probably for most of us, which is okay. But there's still capacity to do a lot. Mm-hmm. And on the other end, kind of, there's that combination of market uncertainty, but also funding uncertainty from government, and that reduces the amount you can do because you want to be a bit cautious. Absolutely. And I think some of that stuff will get better quickly. So I think if you're looking at the next 5 years, I think the market will be better in 5 years' time. I think probably funding will kind of be okay. It's more a question about where we are on capacity, really. So I think everybody in the sector recognises the new home stuff. We know there's a fundamental problem about demand and supply. I think kind of, there'll always be, housing associations always want to develop. You just have to be careful you're doing it in the right way at the right time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a fair point. And obviously we've seen recently the introduction of professional qualifications. Positive, what do you think? How important is it going to be long term for the sector, do you think, to have a professional qualification?
Yeah, I think it's positive in the kind of I do think housing association and housing teams do really good jobs, actually. I mean, I've been out with a lot of housing officers recently as I've been learning my new patch and new job, and the combination of skills they have in terms of interpersonal skills and technical skills is great, and getting that recognised would be good, actually. And I do think in the long term, having that career path within the sector will help us attract more graduates and more more people, and I think that's great. The only thing, my only caveat, there's always got to be a but, right, in answers.
There has to be.
The only but is, I think you need to get over the next 2 years of introducing it, because I think that needs to be done quite sensitively. Because I think if you pull an awful lot of people from frontline roles, and potentially if we lose some people we don't want to qualify who currently are doing the roles, that will be a problem. So I think it's one of those things where in 5 years' time, we'll all think it's a sensible idea, but there might be 2 years of pain. So I think the government, the regulator, the CIAs just need to think carefully about the introduction.
I agree.
But I'm not opposed at all in principle. I think in principle it's a good idea.
I'm not opposed to it, but I've seen this. I started my career doing more social care, and I've seen this be a deterrent to getting people into the sector, and it's needed. But I think from a CIH qualification point of view, we don't need less people to become housing officers, that's for sure. And so we've got to be able to outline the roadmap of how that's going to work for me, like you say, because I think it might put some off, and I think it might mean we lose some of these really good people from our sector that just don't want to go through that process. That is a challenge to fix.
Yeah, so I mean, the housing officer I went out with earlier on this week, actually, to look at some of our homes, was in the police force for the first 15, 20 years of his career. And has got some brilliant kind of skills, in terms of, conversations with our residents, how he understands kind of, their life experience, all of that. You don't want to lose people coming into the profession like that by pulling them off with a qualification. So I kind of entirely agree with that. But I do think there's a way of kind of doing this where you're creating kind of, maybe slightly better career routes than people have had to date, because I think maybe by not recognizing the skills that people have, we've maybe undervalued what they do. So I think I am in favour, but I do think the introduction thing is needs some thought.
Me too. I'm exactly in the same spot on that. And the other thing that I think needs to happen in the sector is we need to inspire and motivate more people to want to develop through the ranks of our organisations. And so one thing I was going to ask you, given how many senior leadership roles you've done in your life, is what would be some of the key pieces of advice you would give to aspiring leaders, aspiring chief execs that are coming through our organisations? What would be some of the insights you've learned that might help them in their journey to become better leaders?
Well, I'd be really positive. I mean, I mentioned G15 Accelerate for
absolutely.
The work we were doing at One, and there's a lot of talent in the sector. There is a lot of talent in the sector. So I think I would not be worried at all about the next generation of directors and chief executives. I think there's an awful lot of brilliant people there. My advice would be, always cautious about giving advice on things like this, I think early in your career, the broader range of experience that you can have, the better.
Yeah.
So, even if your organisation's great, work in different bits of it, or work in different sorts of organisations, or, work outside housing as well as inside.
Yeah.
And I think all of that is, worth doing, because not only does it build your experience, it also builds your contacts. And I think one of the things, particularly when you're doing a new job, actually, one of the things you think about is, God, I wish I could think about this. I wish I could ask somebody about this. And I've got a list of people from various places, not all in housing, where you can give them a call and say, I've got this problem. What do you think? So I think building your experience, building your contact range is really important. And then I do think that there's a set of things that maybe 10 years ago were not important, but really are now. So, data, economics, digital, all of that sort of stuff is, not just in housing. There's a really important set of things that leaders are going to have to kind of think about that maybe when I was coming up doing this were secondary, but they're not anymore. They're really important. And then I think there's a bit of a kind of thing where it's partly the organisation, partly the individual. We need to give people opportunities a bit earlier, and they don't necessarily have to be, they don't have to be promotions, but they have to be opportunities for people to develop and be a bit more curious and kind of develop across the business. And thinking about that, I think, is really important, and because that'll help people stay with you, but it also helps them develop a career.
Yeah, they're all really good insights, and I think the other thing that I would say is I'd encourage businesses to get better at that as well, in terms of seconding individuals into certain areas of the business to give them a breadth of knowledge and experience. Because sometimes you can, in certain disciplines and job classes that we have in housing, you can sometimes be quite linear in the way that your job develops in terms of asset manager, asset director, and all of a sudden it's chief executive and finance and marketing and all the other things that come with it. Yeah. So it's important. And as we finish up,
careers like that are becoming less. Sorry to interrupt. I mean, I think what happens generally is if you've got a career that's run in that narrow way, there comes a point where people, even if you're great at it, there comes a point where you're in an interview and people say, well, he or she's great at that, but they haven't done anything on, I don't know, customer or something. So
whatever.
Having that range the more senior you want to be, having that range is important. And you're not going to be great at everything, right? But being able to speak to a range of things, I think, is much better than being a specialist all the time. And you want to specialize in certain things at certain times, but having that breadth is always, really important.
I totally agree. And as we kind of wrap up, I just wanted to get a final sort of ideas in you and what you're excited about for BPHA and sort of what you're really looking forward to in your tenure as chief exec of the business.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to the next 5 years. I do think the next 5 years is going to be a really good 5 years for us. I think we've got some brilliant opportunities around regeneration and development. And I do think, and this goes back to the COVID point I was making on, I think because of COVID, I think there's more of an appetite now for organisations to think about how they change, because we discovered during COVID that we could run a contact centre from home, for example, and things that people, and I think kind of, for me, I think one of the exciting things about BPHA and housing associations is that possibility of, changing the way we do things in a really, really positive way. And a lot of that will be trying to respond to, our customers, because that's, always going to be our number one thing. So I'm pretty positive, actually, really positive.
Yeah. Well, you are positive. And to be honest, it sounds like you've inherited a great gig. And it sounds like, I'm quite excited to see how it all develops, but certainly you've been given a good platform to go and do some really exciting stuff. And not always is that the case, right? Sometimes you go in, as you said at the beginning, like you go in and run a role and there's a lot to do. And this seems like you've got a really nice footing and a really nice business with a good value set that's ready for that next level of growth and vision.
Yeah, I think that's right. So in my career, I have done turnaround of starting from something that was not great and trying to move it to somewhere better, and that's rewarding in itself. But it can be hard work some days. And I think kind of starting from a good base and thinking about what we do next is a really nice place to be. So I agree.
Well, and a nice way to end it. Thank you for your insights, and I really appreciate you taking the time out to speak to us.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Hip. If you'd like to hear more from us, please be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast platform. We are also running a 30-minute clinic free of charge to any clients that want to recruit in a more inclusive way. For more information, please reach out to us on our website, andersonjames.com.